is one of the interesting phenomena about the growth of naturopathic medicine and the way in which it came first from Europe in the 19th century, the way the principles were evolved and the concepts of vitalism were developed by people like Samuel Thompson and the physiomedicalists, and then the way they went across to America, because various entrepreneurial Americans came across to Europe. In some cases, and this is one of the side lines of the evolution of naturopathy, is that very often people came to it through their need to seek better health themselves. I'll try and remember to give one or two examples of those. But what happened was there was this interchange. There was this busy Atlantic Ocean, because that was the only way they could travel, of course, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that contributed to the formation of the profession. And so it was that it went from Germany and Austria and Central Europe in particular, across to the American East first, of course, and then spread, of course, from them to the American West and to the center, I suppose. And then it was English naturopaths, some of whom were self-taught, some of whom had studied either conventional medicine or were seeking some other way of approaching ill health in their patients. One such example, for example, was a Dr. Bertrand Allinson. Allinson's family name has lived on as providers of whole wheat, whole food, and became famous for its bread. But Allinson himself was a nature cure doctor, and became very interested in what was going on in Europe. But others went across to study with those who had been to Europe and gone back to America and set up mostly residential spas and big clinics, and eventually teaching hospitals. And one of those, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a moment, was Stanley Leaf, who was originally a South African. And Stanley Leaf, I've got a picture of him here. He was a sickly youth who had been given a rather limited life span. That was Stanley Leaf, and one of the most famous naturopaths in the United Kingdom. He went across and studied with Bernard McFadden. I think he spent some time with Henry Lindlar in Chicago. But he came back with a chiropractic degree and also osteopathy, and came back and developed in England such wonderful tools as the neuromuscular technique and others, but also established a clinic. Now, another of these naturopaths who did this was a Scottish man called James C. Thompson. James C. Thompson went and studied in Chicago with Lindlar also, and he came back and established his own practice in Edinburgh in Scotland, where he became quite well known and one of the leading figures in United Kingdom, English and Irish and naturopathic medicine. Now, these were the sort of people that were beginning to develop the profession. We know, of course, that the profession of naturopathy was founded, if you like, the term itself was coined and founded by Benedict Lust in America, and his wife Louisa Lust. They created this profession, and Benedict Lust had, I believe, he'd trained as a medical doctor, but went on to establish the principles and practices of nature cure in a big way that became very important to the foundations of the profession. So this was this two-way exchange, or three-way exchange, I should say, because these sort of people, partly because they needed help. Henry Lindlar was, fortunately for the profession ultimately, was a rather wealthy banker, and he had diabetes and other ailments, and he went to study with Kneipp, I believe, and I think, and of course, people who were using the Priesnitz hydrotherapy approaches. And he went back to America and established, became a naturopath, and indeed became what might be called the father of the of scientific naturopathic medicine. And as everybody involved in naturopathy knows, he set out the principles and articulated them in his books, the principles of naturopathic medicine and the practice of naturopathy. And this was the first attempt, if you like, to codify and set out the foundations upon which our profession has established itself. So then there was James C. Thompson. I think, I'm not sure if he had particular health problems, but anyway, as I've mentioned, he also established a clinic in Edinburgh, which eventually he turned as well. He established a training school there called the Edinburgh School of Natural Therapeutics. How that happened. Now, Leaf had studied with Bernard McFadden. Now, McFadden was a very entrepreneurial American, I think he was, and he published health books and health magazines and was very successful at this. And then he came over to the UK and had endeavored to establish a publishing arm for his publications in London. And arising from that, they enjoyed quite a big following here, and established down on the south coast at a seaside resort called Brighton. He established a residential spa where he treated about 30 or 40 patients at a time. I think they could accommodate down there. And then, unfortunately, the First World War came along and put an end to that. And so, meanwhile, Leaf had gone to America to work with him, having come from South Africa and needing to find help because Leaf was given a rather depressing prognosis. And he concentrated on McFadden's exercise regime and dietary principles and restored himself to health, and lived on to the early 1970s. And I was fortunate enough just to work with him on his particular approach to abdominal adhesions in patients who had undergone surgery. And he had a technique that he called bloodless surgery, in which he did a deep soft tissue technique under deep relaxation. And I remember Terry Moore and I, who were college students at that time, to assist in carrying the patient onto the treatment table, and more importantly, after the procedure, which was done under purple light to encourage the deep relaxation. After establishing that procedure and carrying it out, the patient then had to be carried without any movement on the part of himself, as it were, to rest in a suitable environment to recover from the operation. And so Leaf was famous for that procedure, and indeed famous for developing the neuromuscular technique, which evolved out of a Swedish massage technique, which many naturopathic osteopaths have used since and still do, because it's a particularly valuable way of treating soft tissue procedures. And some naturopaths will be familiar with the textbooks that were written by Leon Chaito, particularly in giving a more modern scientific slant to these soft tissue procedures that are still used. So Leaf established this procedure. Leaf then, when McFadden came back after the First World War and re-established his clinic, he put Leaf in charge as director of therapeutics. Leaf had studied with him and, of course, had graduated from his training school. So Leaf established a place called Orchard Lee in the English countryside, and it stayed at Orchard Lee for 5 years or so, and then moved to a larger country mansion that had belonged to the Rothschild family, the Rothschild banking family. And he established this clinic called Champneys, Nature Cure Clinic, to which many people came, chronically sick people came from all over the world. Now, meanwhile, there was, of course, the growth of the profession. Various other people who both studied in America or graduated or learned things at home with Leaf and others. They set up either their own office practices, or in some cases established small-scale spas where they could take residential patients, perhaps half a dozen or a dozen patients at a time, and give them a more intensive nature cure treatment, just as James C. Thompson was doing up in Edinburgh. But of course, what became very evident was the need for some sort of regulatory process to establish some sort of standards that the general public could recognize as being adequately qualified practitioners. And so this was in about 1920, a number of naturopaths got together, and they met and decided to establish what became the the Nature Cure Association of Great Britain and Ireland. That was 1920, and it was incorporated, in other words, became a legal entity by 1925. And these people who established that were people like James Thompson and Stanley Leaf, and other followers. And one person who was closely involved with that was a naturopath called Milton Powell. And Milton Powell wrote a very nice little book, which I still have, which is called An Outline of Naturopathic Psychotherapy. It was published in 1907. I got my copy in 1967, so it was published in the 1960s. Anyway, Milton Powell was involved in this process as well, and did a lot to try and encourage people to, encourage the profession at least, to unite in an attempt to establish some sort of quality control, which would make sure that the public had an organization to which they could refer and find practitioners who were trained and understood the principles and foundations of naturopathic medicine, as well as having adequate training in anatomy, physiology, and so on. They established a non-profit company. They had a code of professional conduct. They established an ethical committee, and they established the need for regulated training schools. So, and of course, out of this, they were able to establish a professional register. So anyway, inevitably, as time went by, and in the late 20s and 30s, differences began to arise about the aims and objects of what was naturopathy and how it should be defined. And inevitably, there were disagreements. So, as happens in many professions, the Edinburgh School, which by then had been established by James C. Thompson, excuse me a moment, the Edinburgh School and the Edinburgh trained naturopaths didn't like to admit to the use, or didn't recommend as part of naturopathic practice, such things as herbal medicine and homeopathy. Even biochemic tissue salts were regarded as being outside the purview of practicing naturopaths. So they formed a breakaway group, which eventually became the Incorporated Society of Registered Naturopaths, and the ISRN for short. And meanwhile, the war came along, and I suppose discussions came to a halt as people just got on with their lives and coping with the war. World War II, this was, of course. And then afterwards decided in 1945 it was time to do something a little more proactive in order to re-establish the profession. They had already formed the Nature Cure Association of Great Britain and Great Britain and Ireland, as it was called then, and they amalgamated with the to form the British Naturopathic Association, with Stanley Leaf as the first president. Now, there was division not only within the naturopathic profession, but of course between Nature Cure and the medical profession in their outlook. And of course, the British Medical Association, which had been established 100 years before that, was antagonistic towards naturopathic medicine, and a bit like the establishment of the actions of the Flexner, arising out of the Flexner report in America. They tried their best to make medical teaching and training and practice exclusive to medical professionals who had trained in the conventional medical schools. So this meant that there was a sort of internal war of health care, if you like, which necessitated naturopathic physicians and naturopaths throughout Europe, for that matter, becoming operating, if you like, under a situation in which they were constantly being ostracized for what they were doing, despite the fact that they were treating, and very often successfully, many patients who had been failed by the medical profession. And this was what drove Lindlar to Germany. It drove McFadden to establish his health initiatives, and other people whose about whom people can read, incidentally, in this very comprehensive history of the nature doctors, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, written by Wade Boyle and Wilhelm Kirschfeld. Wade Boyle was a lovely guy. I met him when I went to speak at a conference in Tucson of the AANP in the late 80s, early 90s, I think it was. Anyway, they did establish this historical record of what these early doctors were doing, who were laying down philosophy and principles and practical measures that could be used. Meanwhile, back in England, back in the UK, not only were these internecine battles developing, but of course, the professions were trying to move towards better regulatory control. And in the imminence of a statutory registration for osteopaths and chiropractors in the mid-80s meant that the training college, which had been established in Hampstead, that was founded by Stanley Leaf, it eventually ended up in Hampstead as a result of one of Leaf's grateful patients buying for him a house in Hampstead in North London, in which they were able to establish the college in the late 1940s. And he and others kept that and established that as a British College of Naturopathy and Osteopathy, because Leaf quite clearly trained as a chiropractor and an osteopath. He was certain that osteopathy should be regarded as part of naturopathic practice. But with the imminence of the statutory regulation for osteopaths, in other words, state registration, they had to go their own way, as it were. And so the college changed its name. It remained British College of Naturopathy and Osteopathy, but as registration for osteopaths came nearer in the early 90s, I think it was, they decided that it was necessary to separate off the naturopathic element of that. And so the British Naturopathic Association was established, and a general council and register of naturopaths was established, which is still in existence, which is the major registering body that is autonomous. But the consequence of the focus on osteopathy, especially at Fraser House, which was Leaf's college, Leaf's established college, the consequence of this was for the naturopathic element to get somewhat sidelined. And this was one of the regrettable things for the profession, in my view, that eventually they dropped the naturopathic name and they became British College of Osteopathic Medicine. They carried on with their ND degree, a naturopathic diploma, but it seems to have rather fizzled away, I'm sad to see. The consequence of that was because the term naturopathy, naturopathic medicine is not protected. We can practice under common law in the UK, which means that anybody can call themselves anything and set up in practice, unlike the European Napoleonic law, where you cannot do something unless it is legislated for and established as a profession. I think that is, I got that correct. I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me on it. But this was one of the consequences. And so it meant that it was became a bit of a free-for-all in this country. And as things stand, people were able to establish naturopathic schools, so-called naturopathic schools, both on a part-time basis as well as by extended learning. And but very often these were privately run establishments. They didn't appear to be any sort of statutory control to which they had to adhere. Where the osteopaths and chiropractors had very strict criteria, and people couldn't call themselves osteopaths because it's statutorily controlled, or a chiropractor for that matter, without belonging to the main registering body. And we haven't succeeded in achieving that in the UK. And I think it's been to the detriment of naturopathic education that this has tended to happen. And in some cases, the training is of a very good standard, but it tends to be modality based. It tends to be based on teaching a bit of acupuncture and teaching a bit of traditional Chinese medicine, a bit of herbal medicine. Now, this is probably not been the best way to go. I think the profession could have remained eclectic if there had been the drive and the will among people to do it. But the fact of the matter is that each of these professions now have their own autonomy. Medical herbalism, acupuncture, medical, herbal and acupuncture professions have amalgamated to form their own institutes and training establishments, which gives some sort of voluntary control over the profession and some sort of guidance and safeguards for patients seeking these treatments. But as we all know, naturopathic medicine is not defined by what it does, but by the principles upon which it's founded. This is a very important distinction, and it is important too that this distinction is made clear in the training of naturopaths, and that they know they belong to an organization which is eclectic in its services and can embrace acupuncture and embrace herbal medicine. But if they want the specific training in these subjects, they then need to go towards the organizations that can provide that. They're still not statutorily recognized, of course. I think it's likely that the acupuncture profession may eventually achieve that to some degree. The herbal profession may be able to. But there are many other elements of what we do in practice, of course, that have had to be learned or developed from working with people who are able to train them in these specialized subjects. But they at least the members of the register, the General Council and Register of Naturopaths, do have the standards that are required to be able to move forward and study whatever speciality they wish to make use of in practice. And of course, there are many who do, and have indeed followed the training that's offered by Herbal Medicine, National Institute of Medical Herbalists, and the various acupuncture schools which have been established and subscribe to the rules established by the British Acupuncture Association. So that, in essence, is the state we're in at the moment in terms of the evolution of naturopathic medicine in this country.